My boss tried to fire me to give my job to his incompetent nephew, not knowing I was the one keeping his company alive. My boss, Raymond, hired his nephew, Trevor, straight out of college and immediately started planning to give him my job as operations manager, even though I'd been running the department successfully for 5 years. Raymond started by undermining me in meetings, saying things like, "Let's see if we can improve on what we have," whenever I presented my work. He'd assigned Trevor to shadow me, claiming he needed to learn the business, but really Trevor was there to take credit for everything I did. When I streamlined our inventory system, saving the company $40,000 a month, Raymond announced that Trevor had been instrumental in the improvements. When I negotiated better contracts with suppliers, Raymond told everyone Trevor had coached me through it. Trevor couldn't even read a spreadsheet properly, but suddenly he was being praised for my work, while Raymond acted like I was barely competent. Raymond started nitpicking everything I did. My reports were suddenly too detailed, then not detailed enough. My meetings were too long, then too short. He'd change requirements after I'd completed projects, then criticize me for not following instructions. He'd send emails at midnight asking for things by 8 a.m., then write me up for missing deadlines when I delivered them at 8:15. He told other departments I was difficult to work with even though they'd been requesting me specifically for projects for years. The setup became obvious when Raymond started documenting every tiny mistake. I used the wrong color folder for a report that got written up. I parked in the wrong spot on a day the signs were being repainted that became an official warning. He even wrote me up for not attending a meeting he'd never invited me to, claiming I should have known about it. Meanwhile, Trevor was making actual costly mistakes like ordering wrong inventory and losing client accounts, but Raymond covered for him, saying he was still learning. After 6 months of this, Raymond called me into his office with HR present. He had this smug look as he said, "Your performance has been consistently substandard. We're terminating you effective immediately." He'd prepared this whole file of manufactured infractions, using the wrong font in an email, taking 31 minutes for a 30-minute lunch, not saying good morning to him one day when I was on a client call. Complete garbage dressed up as performance issues. I was escorted out while Raymond told everyone I'd been let go for incompetence. Trevor moved into my office that same day. Raymond sent an email to the whole company saying Trevor would be taking over and improving our outdated operations. What Raymond didn't know was that I'd been single-handedly managing relationships with our 3 biggest clients who accounted for 70% of revenue. I'd also been the only person maintaining our custom ordering system that I'd built from scratch. Plus, I was the only one who knew how to fix the warehouse management software that crashed weekly. I'd tried to train others, but Raymond always said it wasn't necessary. Within 3 days, the first client called. Mr. Yamamoto from Techline asked where I was, and why some random kid was trying to handle their account. Trevor had completely botched their monthly order, putting them behind schedule. When Mr. Yamamoto learned I'd been fired, he immediately called Raymond. "You fired the only person who understands our needs? We're reviewing our contract." By the end of the week, the warehouse system crashed. Trevor didn't even know it existed. Orders backed up. Shipments went to wrong addresses. Returns piled up unprocessed. The warehouse manager called Raymond, screaming that everything was falling apart. Then the custom ordering system stopped working because it needed weekly maintenance only I knew how to do. Suddenly, nobody could place orders. The website showed everything as out of stock. Customer service was flooded with complaints. 2 weeks after firing me, Raymond was in full panic mode. He called asking me to come back as a consultant to fix everything. I said my consulting rate was $500 an hour with a 20-hour minimum. He said that was ridiculous. I said good luck then. The second biggest client pulled their contract completely when Trevor sent them the wrong products 3 times in a row. They'd specifically asked for me, and when told I was gone for performance issues, the client laughed. Performance issues? She's the only competent person you had. The third client threatened to leave unless I was rehired. The warehouse staff started quitting because they couldn't function without the systems I'd maintained. Other departments refused to work with Trevor, who didn't understand basic operations. A month after firing me, Raymond's company was hemorrhaging money. He'd lost 2 major clients, and the third was on the way out. His operations were in chaos. His staff was in revolt. Trevor had made so many mistakes they were facing lawsuits. That's when the owner, Mr. Fitzgerald, who'd been hands-off for years, decided to visit. He walked into absolute chaos, made up reasons you better make sure they weren't the one keeping your business alive. Harper stood in the middle of the warehouse watching boxes pile up in completely wrong spots. 3 workers argued loudly near the loading dock about some shipment. One guy kept waving a paper saying the order was supposed to go to Alabama, but somehow it ended up on a truck headed for Alaska. The other 2 were yelling back that they'd followed the labels exactly. Raymond came rushing over with sweat on his forehead, trying to explain this was just temporary growing pains from the transition. Harper held up one hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. She asked where the operations manager was and why basic shipping was failing at this level. Her voice stayed calm, but I heard later from people who were there that her eyes had this sharp look that made Raymond go pale. Raymond started stammering something about performance issues and having to let me go. Harper's expression changed from confused to angry in about 2 seconds. She asked how performance issues with the operations manager could possibly result in the entire operation falling apart like this. If I was so bad at my job, then things should be running better now, right? Raymond opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Harper told him to be in her office in 1 hour and walked away. People said Raymond just stood there looking pale and sweating even more than before. I was at home drinking my second cup of coffee and scrolling through my phone when it rang. Melanie's name showed up and I answered right away. She'd been the warehouse manager until she quit 2 days ago because she couldn't deal with the chaos anymore. She was practically laughing as she told me Harper had shown up at the warehouse completely unannounced. The owner, who nobody had seen in years, just walked in and found everything falling apart. Melanie said the look on Raymond's face was absolutely priceless. She didn't work there anymore, but she still had friends on the warehouse crew who were texting her updates in real time. Apparently, Harper was tearing through the building demanding answers from everyone. Harper spent the whole morning going from the office interviewing department heads. Every single person told her the same thing. They'd all specifically requested to work with me on projects. I'd handled all the major client relationships personally. Raymond had been taking credit for my work while telling everyone I was difficult and incompetent. The marketing director showed Harper emails where I'd solved problems Raymond later claimed he'd fixed. The sales team pulled up records showing I'd negotiated the contracts Raymond bragged about. Josephine from HR sat across from Harper looking nervous as hell. She admitted the termination had seemed really questionable to her. Raymond had insisted he had proper documentation, but she'd raised concerns. He'd overruled her completely. Harper told Josephine to pull Raymond's performance documentation on me right now. Josephine brought in this thick folder that Raymond had prepared. Harper started reading through it and her expression got more and more disgusted. Wrong colored folder for a report. Parking in the wrong spot on a day when signs were being repainted. Not saying good morning one time when I was on a client call. Missing a meeting I was never invited to. Harper looked up at Josephine and asked point blank if HR had actually approved this termination or if Raymond had done it on his own authority. Josephine's face went red and she admitted she'd raised serious concerns about the documentation being manufactured. Raymond had pulled rank and pushed it through anyway. Right in the middle of Harper's investigation, her phone rang. It was the third major client, the one that hadn't left yet but was threatening to. Harper answered and put it on speaker. The client rep said they were done unless I came back immediately. Trevor had completely destroyed 3 months of careful relationship building. He'd messed up orders and ignored their specific requirements and basically treated them like they didn't matter. Harper asked how long I'd worked with them. The client said 4 years with absolutely zero problems until Trevor took over 3 weeks ago. They wanted me back or they were moving their business to a competitor. Harper ended that call and immediately told Raymond to get me on the phone right now. Raymond's face went even more pale and he admitted he'd already tried that. He'd offered me consultant rates to come back and fix everything. Harper asked what rate I'd quoted. Raymond mumbled something about $500 an hour with a 20-hour minimum. Harper asked what I'd said when he called that ridiculous. Raymond looked at the floor and quietly admitted I'd said good luck and hung up on him. I was sitting in Gabriela Velez's office going over my wrongful termination case when my phone started buzzing. The company's main number showed up on the screen. I let it go to voicemail and told Gabriela that Raymond had already called me once offering consultant rates. She smiled and said my leverage had just increased significantly. We should wait and see who calls next and what they offer. She advised me to not seem too eager no matter what they said. My phone buzzed again a few minutes later with a voicemail notification. I played it on speaker so Gabriela could hear. It was Harper herself leaving the message. She personally apologized for what had happened to me. She asked me to please call her back so we could discuss me returning to the company. Her tone stayed professional and businesslike, but I could hear stress underneath it. She left her direct cell number and said to call anytime, day or night. Gabriela raised her eyebrows and nodded slowly. I called Gabriela before calling Harper back because I wanted to know exactly what to ask for. We sat there for an hour going through everything. She told me to document every single thing Raymond had done to me. Get any settlement terms in writing with her reviewing them first. Make absolutely sure I had protection from retaliation if I went back. She said to ask for back pay for the month I was out plus a raise. Get Raymond completely removed from having any authority over me. Make them admit the termination was wrong. I took notes on everything she said and felt my confidence building with each point. I picked up my phone and dialed Harper's number, watching the screen light up with her contact info. She answered on the second ring with a quick hello that sounded tired but focused. I kept my voice calm and professional as I told her I got her message and wanted to discuss the situation. Harper didn't waste time with small talk or excuses. She said she'd been too hands-off with operations and clearly hadn't been paying attention to what was really happening in her own company. She asked directly what it would take to get me back, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background like she was already making notes. I paused for a few seconds to let the silence hang there, then told her I needed time to think about my terms and would send them over by end of business tomorrow. Harper agreed immediately without any pushback, saying whatever I needed within reason, and that she understood I deserved to take time with this decision. We ended the call after maybe 3 minutes total, and I sat there staring at my phone, feeling the shift in power that had just happened. That evening, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and started typing out everything I wanted from this negotiation. Back pay for the entire month I was wrongfully terminated needed to be first on the list, along with a significant raise that reflected my actual value to the company. I wrote down that I wanted a formal written apology from Raymond, acknowledging that the termination was based on manufactured performance issues, and I wanted explicit protection from any kind of retaliation going forward. The biggest item was Raymond's complete removal from any supervisory role over me or my department, and I made sure to write that part in bold text. I sent the whole document to Gabriella around 8 that night, and she called me back within 30 minutes. She read through my list carefully and added a few legal protections about documentation and grievance procedures, then told me it was completely reasonable given how desperate their situation was. She said companies in crisis mode usually agree to almost anything to get critical people back, and I clearly had all the leverage here. I woke up early the next morning and sent my terms to Harper at exactly 8 a.m., then made coffee and tried not to stare at my phone waiting for a response. Harper called at 9 on the dot, and I could hear the relief in her voice as she said she was accepting everything on my list. Then she paused and added that she needed 2 weeks to properly restructure Raymond's role within the company. I cut in immediately and said that wasn't acceptable, that Raymond needed to be completely removed from any operations decisions right now, even if he kept some meaningless title temporarily. There was silence on the other end for maybe 10 seconds, and I stayed quiet, letting her think it through. Finally, Harper said, okay, that she'd make it happen immediately, and Raymond would have zero authority over operations starting today. She asked if I could come in that afternoon to sign paperwork and discuss the transition plan, and I agreed to be there at 2. I arrived at the company building at exactly 2 p.m., and immediately noticed Raymond's office door was open with boxes stacked inside. 2 facilities guys were packing up his desk, while Raymond himself sat in a glass conference room down the hall, looking absolutely destroyed. I walked past the conference room on my way to Harper's office, and Raymond's head snapped up when he saw me. I watched his face cycle through about 5 different emotions in the span of maybe 5 seconds, starting with what looked like shame, then shifting to anger, and finally settling into this defeated resignation. He didn't say anything, and neither did I, and I just kept walking toward the executive suite. Harper stood up when I entered her office and gestured to the chair across from her desk. She looked tired but determined as she formally apologized for not paying closer attention to operations and for trusting Raymond's judgment without ever verifying his claims about my performance. She said she took full responsibility for creating an environment where someone like Raymond could get away with what he did. Then she slid a settlement agreement across the desk that was maybe 15 pages long, and I took my time reading through every single paragraph. Everything I'd asked for was in there, plus an additional severance payment covering the full month I was out. I pulled out a pen from my bag and signed on the last page, and Harper countersigned right below my signature. Harper walked me through the building after we finished the paperwork, stopping at different departments to reintroduce me to staff members. People's faces literally lit up when they saw me, and I could feel the energy in the building shift as word spread that I was coming back. The marketing team stopped their meeting to say hello, and the customer service manager actually hugged me, saying they'd been drowning without proper support. When we got to the warehouse, the crew started cheering and clapping, and about 6 people rushed over asking when I could fix the broken systems. Melanie wasn't there since she'd already quit, but the temporary supervisor told me everyone had been asking about me since the day I left. Harper stood back watching all this with an expression I couldn't quite read, maybe realizing for the first time how much damage Raymond had actually caused. I spent the rest of that afternoon walking through the facility and assessing exactly how bad things had gotten. 3 weeks of orders were backed up in the system with no clear organization or priority. The database showed corrupted data in multiple places where Trevor had apparently tried to fix things without understanding how anything worked. 2 major clients were already completely gone, and the third one was supposedly waiting for my call before making their final decision. The warehouse floor was chaos with packages in wrong locations and returns piled up in corners because nobody knew the proper processing procedures. Harper gave me full authority to do whatever I needed to fix this mess, and she assigned Stanley from the finance department to help me understand the complete monetary impact of the disaster. Stanley met me in my old office, which was now mine again, carrying a laptop and a thick folder of financial reports. He pulled up spreadsheets showing preliminary numbers from the past month, and I felt my stomach drop as I saw the totals. The company had lost over $400,000 in the single month I was gone, and Stanley walked me through how that broke down. Lost clients accounted for about $200,000. Wrong shipments and returns ate up another $70,000. Rush shipping to fix Trevor's mistakes cost $50,000. And overtime costs from everyone working extra hours to manage the chaos added another $80,000. I let out a low whistle and shook my head. And Stanley said this didn't even count the long-term reputation damage with clients who were now questioning whether they could trust the company. He closed his laptop and told me honestly that if I hadn't come back, they were probably looking at bankruptcy within 6 months. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Kieran Bailey's contact at Techline, taking a deep breath before hitting the call button. He answered with a cautious hello, and I could hear the question in his voice before he even said my name. I told him I was back at the company with full authority to fix everything that had gone wrong, and he sounded cautiously pleased but definitely skeptical. He asked directly if I really had the power to make changes, or if this was just another false promise. I apologized for the complete disaster Trevor had created with their account, and explained that ownership had made major changes in operations leadership. Then I asked for 2 weeks to prove we could get back to the service level they'd experienced when I was managing their account personally. Kieran was quiet for a moment, then said he appreciated the honesty and direct communication. Kieran told me they'd already started talking to 3 different competitors and had proposals on his desk right now. He said 2 weeks was a tight timeline, but he was willing to pause the contract cancellation process if I personally guaranteed oversight of every single order. I promised him daily updates on order status and personal review of everything before it shipped, and I meant every word of it. Kieran's tone shifted slightly, and he said that was exactly what he needed to hear, that the personal attention and expertise was what made our partnership work in the first place. He warned me there was zero tolerance for any more mistakes, that his company had been patient, but their own clients were now upset about delays. I told him I understood completely, and would treat their account as my top priority until we rebuilt the trust that had been damaged. We ended the call with an agreement to touch base the next morning, and I sat back in my chair feeling the weight of everything I'd just committed to fixing. I started that first day back at 6 a.m. and didn't leave until after midnight. The warehouse looked like a disaster zone with boxes stacked wrong and orders mixed up in ways that made no sense. I pulled the team together and walked them through the sorting system I'd built years ago, showing them how to read the labels and organize shipments by priority level. They jumped on it immediately, grateful to have clear instructions after weeks of confusion. By lunch, we'd reorganized half the warehouse floor, and I could see the relief on everyone's faces as the chaos started taking shape. I spent the afternoon in the system fixing corrupted data entries one by one, my eyes burning from staring at spreadsheets for hours straight. The ordering system needed a complete rebuild of its maintenance protocols, so I documented every step as I worked, creating guides so this wouldn't happen again. Around 7 p.m., I personally checked every shipment going out the next morning, catching 3 that were headed to wrong addresses and fixing them before they left the building. The warehouse supervisor kept thanking me, and I told him we'd get through this together as a team. I grabbed dinner from a vending machine and went back to my desk to handle client emails that had piled up during the disaster. Every muscle ached when I finally drove home, but I felt satisfied knowing we'd made real progress. The next 5 days followed the same pattern with me arriving before dawn and leaving after dark, rebuilding everything Trevor had broken through incompetence. The team worked overtime willingly because they finally had leadership that knew what they were doing, and I made sure to thank each person individually for their effort. By Thursday, we'd cleared almost half the backlog, and the system crashes had stopped completely. Friday morning, I was at my desk reviewing shipping manifests when Trevor appeared in my doorway looking uncomfortable. He shifted his weight from foot to foot and asked if he could talk to me for a minute. I gestured to the chair across from my desk, and he sat down, not meeting my eyes. He said his uncle had told him this would be an easy job, that he'd just need to show up and the department would run itself. I kept my face neutral and let him talk. Trevor admitted he had no idea how complicated operations actually were, or how much work went into keeping everything running smoothly. He said he felt terrible about what happened and knew I had every right to be angry with him. I told him I appreciated the apology and understood he'd been put in an impossible situation by Raymond. I said right now I was focused on fixing the damage and getting the company back on track, and he nodded, looking relieved I wasn't yelling at him. He thanked me and left quickly, and I went back to work feeling like maybe the kid wasn't completely hopeless, just totally unprepared. Saturday morning, I came in to finish the week strong, and by noon I'd restored full functionality to every critical system in the building. The backlog was down to 40%, and orders were flowing smoothly again for the first time in a month. Monday morning, I opened my email to find a message from Kieran at Techline saying their latest order had arrived exactly as specified with perfect timing. He wrote that this was the quality they'd come to expect from us, and he was glad to see things back to normal. 20 minutes later, Harper forwarded that same email to the entire leadership team with a note at the top. She wrote that this was what competent operations management looked like, and thanked me for the incredible turnaround. I felt validation wash over me after months of Raymond undermining my work and telling everyone I was incompetent. The other department heads started replying with congratulations, and several mentioned how glad they were to have me back. Tuesday afternoon, Josephine from HR stopped by my office and closed the door behind her. She said she wanted to give me a heads up that Raymond had been officially moved to a business development role with no operational authority. His new office was in the building across the parking lot, and he wouldn't be involved in any decisions related to my department. I asked what business development even meant, and Josephine smiled slightly, saying it was basically a meaningless title, while Harper built a case to terminate him properly. She said Harper was being careful to document everything, so Raymond couldn't claim wrongful termination the way he'd manufactured charges against me. I thanked her for the information, and she left looking satisfied that justice was slowly working its way through the system. The gossip chain confirmed it by end of day, with people saying Raymond had been sidelined into complete irrelevance. Wednesday morning, I drove to the third major client's office downtown for a meeting I'd scheduled the week before. Their procurement director met me in the conference room looking skeptical but willing to listen. I presented a detailed recovery plan with specific metrics for order accuracy, delivery timelines, and quality control measures. I showed them the progress we'd made in 2 weeks and laid out exactly how we'd prevent future problems. They asked tough questions about staffing and system reliability, and I answered everyone honestly. The procurement director admitted they'd mainly been planning to leave because Trevor seemed to have no idea what he was doing, and they couldn't risk their supply chain on incompetence. I acknowledged the disaster and took responsibility for rebuilding their trust through consistent performance. They agreed to stay on a provisional basis with monthly reviews for the next quarter, and I left feeling like I'd saved the account through preparation and honesty. 2 weeks after I returned, Harper called an all-staff meeting in the main warehouse space. Everyone crowded in looking curious and slightly nervous about what the owner might say. Harper stood on a small platform so everyone could see her, and announced that operations were stabilizing after a difficult period. She praised the warehouse team for their hard work during the recovery, and specifically thanked me by name for my leadership in turning everything around. The applause started immediately and felt genuine, not the polite clapping you get at corporate meetings. People were smiling at me, and several gave me thumbs-up signs from across the room. Harper continued talking about the company's future, but I barely heard it because I felt so validated after months of Raymond telling everyone I was barely competent. When the meeting ended, people came up to shake my hand and tell me how glad they were I came back. I called Melanie that evening and asked if she'd consider returning as warehouse manager with a significant raise and my personal apology for what she'd gone through. She said yes before I even finished explaining the offer, telling me she'd missed the job but couldn't work under the chaos Trevor had created. I told her I needed someone I could trust completely to help rebuild the department properly, and she was the only person I wanted for the role. She started the following Monday, and immediately the warehouse recovery accelerated with her expertise and leadership. Having her back felt like getting a missing piece of the puzzle returned. Thursday afternoon, Stanley from finance asked me to join him in Harper's office for a presentation. I walked in to find Harper behind her desk looking serious, and Stanley setting up his laptop. He pulled up a detailed financial analysis showing that Raymond's decision to fire me had cost the company nearly $600,000 in just 1 month. The numbers broke down lost client revenue, wrong shipment costs, rushed delivery fees, overtime expenses, and system downtime impacts. Harper's face got harder as Stanley walked through each category, explaining how the disaster had compounded. She asked him to document everything thoroughly for the board meeting scheduled for next week. Stanley said he'd have a complete report ready, and Harper thanked us both for the work we'd done to quantify the damage. I left that meeting feeling like the evidence against Raymond was building into something he couldn't escape. Friday morning, Trevor knocked on my office door looking uncomfortable again. He said he'd decided to give his notice because operations management wasn't for him, and he was going back to the school. I told him I genuinely wished him well because he was just a kid who'd been put in an impossible situation by his uncle's nepotism. He thanked me for not making things harder than they already were, and said he'd learned an important lesson about being put in roles you're not ready for. I shook his hand, and he left looking relieved to escape with some dignity and tact. Monday, I was rebuilding corrupted files in the system when I found old emails dating back over 2 years. They showed Raymond had been taking credit for my work systematically, forwarding my reports to upper management with his name on them, and claiming my cost savings as his initiatives. My stomach turned as I read through months of him stealing credit while undermining me to my face. I printed everything and brought the evidence to Harper's office. She looked disgusted as she read through the emails, her jaw tightening with each page. She said it confirmed what she'd suspected about Raymond's character, and asked if I was willing to document everything for his termination case. I said absolutely, and spent the rest of the day organizing a timeline of his misconduct, with supporting evidence for each incident. I spent that weekend at my apartment building the case against Raymond piece by piece. Saturday morning, I pulled every email I'd saved going back 3 years and started organizing them into categories. Credit theft was the biggest folder with dozens of examples where Raymond forwarded my work to upper management with his name attached. Performance manipulation was next, showing his pattern of changing requirements after projects finished, then writing me up for not meeting the new standards. Client endangerment was third, documenting times he'd pulled me off critical accounts or blocked my access to important information. By Saturday evening, my dining table was covered in printed documents organized into neat stacks with sticky notes marking the most damaging examples. Sunday, I typed everything into a detailed timeline with supporting evidence linked to each incident. The document ran 40 pages by the time I finished, and every claim had at least 2 pieces of proof backing it up. I emailed the whole file to Gabriella Sunday night, asking her to review it for any legal issues. She called me Monday morning saying the documentation was solid and would hold up under any scrutiny. She pointed out a few places where I should add context about normal business practices to show how far outside standard Raymond had operated. I made her suggested changes and sent the updated version back within an hour. Gabriella confirmed it was ready and told me to send it to Harper whenever I felt the timing was right. Tuesday morning, Harper's assistant called asking if I could present at the board meeting Thursday afternoon. The board wanted a detailed update on operational recovery, and Harper specifically requested that I deliver it personally. I said yes and spent Tuesday and Wednesday building a presentation showing before and after metrics. The slides told the story clearly with graphs showing the chaos during my absence and the steady recovery since my return. Client satisfaction scores had dropped to 40% during Trevor's month and were back up to 92% now. Order accuracy had fallen to 73% and was now at 98%. On-time delivery went from 61% to 96%. The warehouse backlog chart showed the mountain of problems that built up and how we'd systematically cleared it. Every metric demonstrated the same pattern of collapse and recovery. I added a final section showing cost savings with Stanley's calculations, proving we were now saving $15,000 more per month than before the crisis, because the recovery forced us to optimize systems we'd been running inefficiently. Thursday afternoon, I walked into the boardroom carrying my laptop and a folder of backup documents. Harper sat at the head of the table with 8 board members arranged on both sides. I recognized a few faces from company events, but most were people I'd never met. Harper introduced me as the director of operations and asked me to walk everyone through the recovery progress. I connected my laptop to the projector and started with the timeline showing when I was terminated and when I returned. The board members leaned forward as I walked through each metric showing the operational collapse. One older woman with gray hair asked what specifically caused the systems to fail so completely. I explained that I'd built and maintained custom software for ordering and warehouse management, and when I left, nobody else knew how to keep them running. A younger guy in an expensive suit asked why there was no backup support or documentation. I said I'd tried multiple times to train others and create documentation, but my former supervisor said it wasn't a priority. Harper's expression stayed neutral, but I saw her jaw tighten slightly. I continued through the recovery slides showing how we'd rebuilt each system and cleared the backlog. The board members started asking more questions about client relationships and how we'd prevented the third major client from leaving. I explained my personal history with each account and how I'd worked directly with them to rebuild trust. The older woman said she was impressed by the turnaround speed and asked Harper directly what had happened to cause such a capable manager to be terminated in the first place. Harper took a breath and said she'd been investigating that question thoroughly. She explained that Raymond had manufactured performance issues and terminated me without proper cause while taking credit for my work over an extended period. She said the decision had been made to give my position to his nephew, despite the nephew having no relevant experience. One board member actually laughed and asked if that was a joke. Harper said unfortunately it wasn't, and that Raymond's mismanagement had cost the company nearly $600,000 in 1 month. She mentioned the evidence I'd compiled showing systematic credit theft and negligent decisions that endangered client relationships. The board members started talking over each other, asking to see the documentation. Harper looked at me and I pulled up my laptop, sending the 40-page file to her email. She forwarded it to the whole board and asked for a 10-minute recess while everyone reviewed the key sections. The board members pulled out phones and tablets, reading through the evidence. I sat quietly watching their faces change from curious to shocked to angry. The recess stretched to 20 minutes as people kept reading and asking Harper clarifying questions. When everyone finally settled back into their seats, the older woman said this was completely unacceptable and asked what Harper planned to do about it. Harper said she was bringing the termination recommendation to the board for a vote based on documented misconduct. The board members barely discussed it before the older woman called for a vote. She asked who supported terminating Raymond for cause, and every single hand went up. The vote was unanimous. Harper thanked the board and said she'd handle the notification that afternoon. The meeting shifted to other business, but I could see the board members were still processing what they'd learned. After the meeting ended, Harper asked me to stay behind. She said the board was extremely impressed with my presentation and the recovery I'd led. She also apologized again for not catching Raymond's behavior sooner. I told her I appreciated the support and asked when Raymond would be notified. She checked her watch and said she'd call him in about an hour once she had all the termination paperwork ready. I left the building feeling like justice was finally happening. I was back at my desk working through emails when Josephine stopped by around 4 that afternoon. She said Harper had just called Raymond into her office and delivered the termination notice. Raymond tried arguing that the board didn't understand the full context and that I'd manipulated the evidence. Harper apparently cut him off and said the board had voted unanimously based on documented facts, and his employment was terminated effective immediately. Josephine said Raymond's face went red and he started raising his voice, but Harper stayed completely calm and professional. Security arrived within minutes to escort him out per standard protocol. Josephine said Raymond looked shocked that it was actually happening, like he'd convinced himself he was untouchable. She told me he'd be clearing out his office tomorrow morning and then he'd be gone for good. I thanked her for the update and she smiled, saying it was the right outcome, even if it took too long to happen. The next morning, I had an early meeting with the warehouse team, so I was walking through the main hallway around 8 when I saw Raymond coming out of his office carrying a cardboard box. 2 security guards walked on either side of him, making sure he didn't access any computers or take anything beyond personal items. Raymond's face was tight and angry as he walked toward the exit. We made eye contact as he passed, and I saw pure resentment in his expression. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but one of the security guards shifted slightly, and Raymond closed it again. I nodded once professionally and kept walking toward the warehouse. I heard the exit door close behind him and realized that was probably the last time I'd ever see him. The feeling was more relief than satisfaction. That afternoon, Harper called me into her office. She said the board had discussed my role extensively during their private session after I left, and they'd authorized her to offer me a significant promotion. She slid a folder across her desk containing an offer letter for Director of Operations, with Raymond's former salary plus a 30% increase. The position came with full authority over the department, a larger budget for team building and system upgrades, and a seat at the weekly executive leadership meetings. I read through the offer, carefully noting the details about reporting structure and decision-making authority. Harper said I'd earned this through my work, and the board specifically wanted me in leadership. I told her I was interested but wanted to negotiate a few additional terms. She said she expected that and asked what I needed. I said I wanted budget approval to hire 2 additional operations specialists, so we'd never again have a single point of failure where one person leaving could crash everything. Harper nodded and said that made sense. I also wanted authority to implement a comprehensive training program and documentation system, so all critical knowledge was shared across the team. Harper agreed immediately. Finally, I wanted a clear policy that no family members of executives could be hired into operations without going through the standard interview process with multiple interviewers. Harper actually smiled at that one and said she'd make sure it was added to company policy. She asked if I accepted with those terms, and I said yes. We shook hands, and she said she'd have the updated offer letter ready by end of day. I used my new authority to start building the team I'd always known we needed. I posted job listings for 2 operations specialists focusing on candidates with supply chain experience and systems management skills. Harper approved the budget without hesitation and told me to hire the best people I could find. I also started working with the IT department to document every custom system and process we used. The goal was creating detailed guides that any qualified person could follow to maintain our operations. It was tedious work, but absolutely necessary. Harper checked in weekly, asking about progress and offering support for anything I needed. The difference between working for her versus Raymond was night and day. She trusted my expertise and backed my decisions instead of undermining me at every turn. 3 months after I'd returned to the company, everything had stabilized into smooth operations. All 3 major clients were not just satisfied, but actively happy with our service. The backlog was completely cleared, with our current orders processing faster than ever. I'd implemented new efficiency improvements in how we routed shipments and managed inventory that were generating even better cost savings than before. Stanley stopped by my office one morning with updated financial projections. He showed me that we were now saving $55,000 monthly compared to the $40,000 I'd achieved before getting fired. The additional savings came from the forced optimization we'd done during recovery, when we had to rebuild everything from scratch. Stanley said the board was thrilled with the numbers, and Harper had specifically mentioned my leadership in her quarterly report. I felt proud of what we'd built, but also aware that it had taken a crisis to get the resources and support I'd needed all along. That afternoon, I got an email from Kieran at Techline with a personal note attached. He said their CEO had reviewed our performance over the past 3 months and was so impressed with the recovery and consistent quality that they wanted to expand their contract by 30%. Kieran wrote that he'd personally told their CEO about my professionalism and expertise and how I'd turned around a disaster situation. He thanked me for making him look good to his own leadership. I forwarded the email to Harper with a brief note about the contract expansion. She responded within minutes with congratulations and approval for the team bonus I'd proposed last week. She said this kind of client feedback was exactly what the company needed, and I should feel proud of what I'd accomplished. I spent the next few weeks implementing a comprehensive training program for the entire operations team. Every person needed to understand the critical systems and how to handle basic maintenance and troubleshooting. I created detailed documentation for each process with step-by-step instructions and screenshots. Melanie worked with me on this and quickly became the second person who understood everything as deeply as I did. I promoted her to Assistant Director of Operations and made sure she had full access to all systems and authority to make decisions when I wasn't available. The team culture shifted from stressed and chaotic to collaborative and strong. People actually seemed to enjoy coming to work now that they had clear direction, proper training, and a manager who supported them instead of undermining them. One morning, I got an unexpected email from Jeffrey Nakamura at the client company that had pulled their contract during the disaster. He asked if there was any chance of rebuilding the relationship now that he'd heard through industry contacts that I was back and promoted to director level. He said they'd moved to a new supplier after leaving us, but had been having consistent problems with quality and communication. I replied suggesting we meet to discuss what a renewed partnership might look like. We scheduled lunch for the following week at a restaurant halfway between our offices. Jeffrey arrived looking tired and frustrated. He admitted right away that leaving had been a mistake made in anger, but they'd already committed to the new supplier contract. However, that contract was up for renewal in 2 months, and he had authority to negotiate with other vendors. I proposed starting with a smaller trial contract to rebuild trust on both sides. We could handle their secondary product line for 3 months, and if that went well, we'd discuss expanding back to the full partnership. Jeffrey agreed immediately and said he'd send over the details within a few days. As we finished lunch, he told me their new supplier had no one with my level of expertise or attention to detail, and he'd missed working with someone who actually understood their business. I told him I appreciated the second chance and wouldn't let him down. The contract with Jeffrey's company came through 2 weeks later, and I signed it in my office with Melanie watching over my shoulder. She pointed out that we'd now recovered all 3 major clients, plus added 2 new ones, and our revenue was actually higher than before the crisis. I filed the signed contract and pulled up my calendar to schedule the first implementation meeting. Harper sent me an email that afternoon asking me to stop by her office when I had a moment. I walked down the hall and found her reviewing what looked like board meeting notes. She gestured for me to sit and closed her laptop. The board had their quarterly review yesterday, and my name came up multiple times in a positive way. Several board members specifically mentioned my leadership as a key factor in the company's recovery and growth. One board member apparently said that promoting me to Director of Operations was one of the best decisions the company had made in years. Harper told me my job was completely secure, and I had her full support for any initiatives I wanted to pursue. She asked if I had any major projects in mind, and I mentioned wanting to expand the training program and possibly add another operations specialist. She approved both ideas immediately and said to send her the budget proposals whenever I was ready. 6 months passed with steady progress and improvements across all departments. I was grabbing coffee at the shop near my apartment one Saturday morning when I spotted Raymond sitting alone at a corner table. He looked tired and his suit wasn't as crisp as it used to be. Our eyes met and I saw him tense up like he was deciding whether to leave. I walked over and said hello, keeping my tone neutral and professional. He mumbled something about working as a consultant now and doing some contract work for small businesses. I told him I hoped things were going well for him and meant it without any sarcasm. We stood there awkwardly for a few seconds before I excused myself to get my coffee. Walking back to my car, I realized I didn't feel angry anymore, or even particularly satisfied about how things had turned out for him. I just felt glad that I'd stood my ground and fought for what I deserved, instead of accepting his manufactured performance issues as truth. 2 weeks later, Harper forwarded me an email from an industry association announcing their annual awards. The company had been nominated for operational excellence based on our efficiency metrics and client satisfaction scores. Harper wrote that she'd already submitted our application materials and thought we had a strong chance of winning. The award ceremony was scheduled for next month at a hotel downtown. I didn't think much about it until Harper called me into her office 6 weeks later with a huge smile on her face. We'd won the award and she insisted I accept it on behalf of the team, since the improvements were directly tied to my leadership and systems. I tried to suggest she accept it as the owner, but she refused, saying everyone knew I was the reason for the turnaround. The ceremony was on a Thursday evening, and I wore my best professional outfit. Walking onto that stage to accept the award while people applauded felt like complete vindication for everything I'd gone through with Raymond. The presenter read a summary of our recovery story, and several people in the audience nodded like they'd heard about what happened. I gave a brief speech thanking my team and Harper for supporting operational excellence. Holding that award plaque in my hands made all the difficult months feel worth it. 3 weeks after the award ceremony, I got a LinkedIn message from a recruiter at a major competitor. They'd heard about the award and wanted to discuss a senior operations position they were trying to fill. The salary range they mentioned was significantly higher than what I was making. I agreed to a phone call mostly out of curiosity. The recruiter described a role that sounded interesting, but not necessarily better than what I already had. I thanked them for reaching out and said I was happy in my current position. The recruiter asked if there was a number that would change my mind, and I gave them a figure that was 30% higher than my current salary. They said they'd get back to me. 2 days later, they called back and said they could match that number. I told them I needed to think about it and would respond by the end of the week. Instead of responding to the recruiter, I scheduled a meeting with Harper and laid out the situation honestly. I told her I'd built something here I was proud of and didn't really want to leave, but the offer was substantial. Harper didn't hesitate and said she'd match it immediately because she couldn't afford to lose me. She had the paperwork drawn up that same afternoon, and I signed the new compensation agreement. I emailed the recruiter declining their offer and thanking them for the opportunity. Staying felt right, because I'd invested so much in building these systems and this team. A LinkedIn notification popped up on my phone a few weeks later showing that Trevor had sent me a connection request. I accepted it, and he immediately sent a message. He wrote that he was back in the school studying accounting instead of operations, and wanted to thank me for treating him with respect during a difficult time. He said he'd learned an important lesson about being put in roles you're not ready for, and appreciated that I never made things harder for him than they already were. I replied wishing him well with his studies and meant it. Trevor had been a kid thrown into an impossible situation by his uncle's nepotism and bad judgment. He'd at least recognized he was in over his head, even if it took a disaster to make that clear. Melanie and I were invited to speak at an industry conference about operational recovery and crisis management. The conference was in a neighboring state, and we drove there together going over our presentation notes. We'd prepared a detailed case study about documentation, systems knowledge, and rebuilding after major operational failures. Our session was scheduled for Saturday afternoon, and about 40 people showed up. We walked through the timeline of what happened, how we identified critical failure points, and the steps we took to rebuild. Several attendees approached us afterward saying our story about the importance of documentation and systems knowledge really resonated with them. One woman from a manufacturing company said they'd just gone through something similar when their longtime plant manager retired without proper succession planning. We exchanged contact information with people who were building similar programs at their companies. The conference organizers asked if we'd be willing to present at their next regional event, and we agreed. Harper called me into her office the week after the conference and asked if I'd be interested in joining the leadership team's strategic planning committee. She said she valued my operational perspective on company growth and wanted me involved in future direction decisions. I accepted knowing this would give me real influence over where the company was heading. The first committee meeting was the following Tuesday, and included Harper, Stanley from finance, the head of sales, and 2 other senior managers. They welcomed me and actually listened when I offered input about operational capacity and scalability. Harper specifically asked my opinion on a potential expansion into a new market, and I laid out the infrastructure requirements and timeline we'd need. The sales head nodded and said he hadn't considered those factors. Having a seat at this table felt like recognition that operations wasn't just a support function, but a core driver of business strategy. A potential client reached out through our website contact form asking about our services. The initial inquiry mentioned they'd heard about our operational excellence and recovery story through industry contacts. I scheduled a call with their procurement director who explained they needed a distribution partner with proven crisis management capabilities. Their current vendor had failed during a supply chain disruption, and they were looking for someone more resilient. I walked them through our systems, redundancies, and recovery protocols. They were impressed and wanted to move forward with a trial contract. I assembled an implementation team, and we kicked off the project the following week. The client had specific requirements and tight deadlines, but we exceeded their expectations from day one. Their procurement director sent an email after the first month saying we'd already proven more reliable than their previous vendor. Harper forwarded the email to the leadership team with a note about how new business was coming to us specifically because of our operational reputation. I posted a job opening for a junior operations coordinator and received over 50 applications. One resume stood out from a recent college graduate who'd studied supply chain management and had done internships at 2 logistics companies. I brought her in for an interview, and she reminded me of myself starting out, eager and capable with good instincts. I hired her and committed to mentoring her properly, unlike what happened with Trevor. Her first week, I had her shadow different team members to understand how each function worked. She asked smart questions and took detailed notes. By her second month, she was handling routine tasks independently and suggesting small improvements to our processes. Teaching her gave me satisfaction knowing I was building sustainable success instead of hoarding knowledge. She'd be ready to step into a more senior role within a year or 2. Stanley stopped by my office one afternoon with his laptop and a satisfied expression. He'd finished a comprehensive financial analysis comparing our current profitability to the period before the crisis. The numbers showed we were actually more profitable now because the recovery had forced us to optimize systems and eliminate inefficiencies we'd been tolerating for years. We'd cut waste, improved accuracy, and streamlined processes in ways we probably wouldn't have done without the crisis forcing our hand. Harper stopped by while Stanley was still there, and he showed her the analysis. She laughed and said Raymond had accidentally done us a favor by creating a crisis that led to improvements. I smiled at the irony, but knew the real reason for our success was that we'd learned from the disaster and built something stronger. I started looking at houses the following month with the real estate agent my friend recommended. The increased salary and bonuses from my director position meant I could afford something way better than my apartment, and after years of renting, I was ready to own something. The agent showed me 3 properties, but the second one felt right the moment I walked in. A 2-bedroom house with an updated kitchen and a small backyard. I put in an offer that same day, and it got accepted within 48 hours. 3 weeks later, I sat in the title company office signing mortgage papers while the agent pointed to each highlighted section. My hand moved across page after page of documents, and as I signed my name, I thought about how different things could have been if I'd accepted Raymond's first consultant offer or just given up when he fired me. Standing my ground and knowing my worth changed everything. The closing took 90 minutes, and when I walked out, I had keys to my own house. Josephine from HR stopped by my office 2 days after I moved in, asking if I had time to discuss a project Harper wanted us to work on together. She sat down across from my desk and explained that Harper was concerned about preventing future situations like what happened with Raymond, and she wanted to revise the company's entire performance management system. Josephine pulled out a folder with the current policies, and we spent the next hour going through documentation requirements, appeal processes, and oversight procedures. I pointed out how Raymond had exploited vague language and lack of review standards to manufacture my termination case, and Josephine took detailed notes on every gap I identified. We met 3 more times over the next 2 weeks, creating better documentation requirements that would prevent managers from writing people up for ridiculous things like wrong-colored folders. I drafted language requiring specific performance metrics and concrete examples for any disciplinary action, and Josephine added mandatory HR review before any termination could proceed. We built in an appeal process where employees could challenge write-ups through an independent committee, and we created standards requiring progressive discipline with clear improvement plans before firing someone. Harper reviewed our proposal and approved the new policies immediately, then had them distributed company-wide with a memo explaining the changes were designed to ensure fair and professional performance management. 1 year after returning to the company, I was managing a team of 8 people with clear succession plans and documented processes for everything critical. The operational metrics were the best they'd been in 10 years, with client satisfaction scores above 95% and efficiency improvements generating $60,000 in monthly savings. My team included the junior coordinator I'd hired, who was now handling complex projects independently, plus 3 specialists I'd brought on to prevent single points of failure, Melanie running the warehouse and 2 analysts managing our systems and data. Everyone knew how to do multiple functions, and we documented every critical process, so knowledge wasn't locked in anyone's head. Harper sent a company-wide email one morning crediting the operations team's excellence, and specifically mentioning how our department had become a model for the rest of the company. Several people from other departments forwarded the email to me with congratulations, and my team seemed proud to be recognized. A podcast host reached out through LinkedIn asking if I'd be interested in being interviewed for her show about workplace advocacy and knowing your value. She'd heard my story through someone in the industry and thought it would resonate with her audience. I agreed, and we scheduled a recording session for the following week. The interview lasted 45 minutes, and I shared the whole story about being fired for manufactured performance issues, watching the company collapse without me, and negotiating my return from a position of strength. The host asked great questions about recognizing your worth and standing firm in negotiations, and I talked about how getting fired ended up being the push I needed to demand proper compensation and respect. The episode went live 2 weeks later, and within days I started getting emails from listeners saying my story inspired them to stand up for themselves in similar situations. One woman wrote that she'd been accepting unfair treatment from her boss for years, but hearing my experience gave her courage to document everything and go to HR. Another listener said he'd just negotiated a significant raise after realizing he'd been undervaluing his contributions like I had. The company promoted Melanie to Assistant Director of Operations 3 months later, and I felt proud watching her growth and leadership development over the past year. She'd gone from managing just the warehouse to overseeing logistics, inventory, and shipping with real strategic thinking about how to improve processes. Harper announced the promotion in a staff meeting, and Melanie gave a short speech thanking the team, and specifically mentioning my mentorship. After the meeting, she stopped by my office and told me that working with me taught her what good management actually looks like, how to develop people instead of just directing them, and how to build systems that work. I realized sitting there that I'd become the mentor I wish I'd had earlier in my career, someone who actually invested in developing their team instead of hoarding knowledge and credit like Raymond did. Harper called a leadership meeting 6 months after that to announce she was restructuring the board to include more operational oversight, after learning from what happened with Raymond. She explained that the board had been too focused on financial metrics without understanding how operations actually functioned, which let Raymond's mismanagement go unnoticed for too long. She wanted to add advisory positions that would give operational leaders direct input into company direction and strategic decisions. Harper looked directly at me and asked if I'd be interested in joining the board in an advisory capacity, attending quarterly meetings and providing operational perspective on major decisions. I accepted immediately, knowing this gave me real influence over company direction beyond just my department. The other executives congratulated me after the meeting, and the CFO said having operations represented at the board level was long overdue. Jeffrey Nakamura reached out 8 months into his trial contract, saying his company wanted to expand back to full partnership. We met for lunch, and he admitted that leaving had been a mistake, but he was glad we'd found our way back to working together. His company had struggled with their replacement vendor who couldn't match our reliability or responsiveness, and the trial period had reminded them why they'd worked with us for years before Trevor ruined everything. I told him I appreciated the second chance to prove what we could do, and that we'd learned important lessons about protecting client relationships during the crisis. We signed the expanded contract that afternoon, and Jeffrey sent a note to Harper praising the operations team's performance. Harper forwarded it to me with a message saying this was exactly the kind of relationship rebuilding that proved our recovery was real and lasting. An industry magazine contacted me about doing a feature article on operational leadership and crisis recovery. They'd been tracking our company's turnaround and wanted to profile how we'd gone from near collapse to industry excellence in under 2 years. I agreed to the interview and spent 2 hours with their reporter walking through the whole timeline from Raymond's mismanagement through the recovery process. The article came out 3 months later with my photo on the cover, and the headline talking about turning crisis into opportunity. They included quotes from Kieran and Jeffrey praising the company's operational turnaround, and specifically crediting my leadership. My parents called the day the magazine hit stands, saying they'd bought 5 copies, and when I visited them the following weekend, they'd framed the cover and hung it in their living room next to my college graduation photo. Seeing their pride made me emotional because they'd supported me through the worst parts of getting fired when I wasn't sure what would happen next. 2 years after being fired, I sat in my office as director of operations with a strong team, happy clients, and the respect of everyone in the company. The office was bigger now, with windows overlooking the warehouse floor where everything ran smoothly under Melanie's management. My desk had photos from the industry award ceremony and the magazine cover, plus a plant my team had given me for my work anniversary. I thought about Raymond's smug face when he fired me, how certain he'd been that I was dispensable and Trevor could easily replace me. The best revenge wasn't getting him fired or watching the company nearly collapse. It was simply being excellent at what I do and building something that proved my actual worth. Harper stopped by my office late on a Friday afternoon asking if I had a few minutes. She closed the door and sat down with an envelope, then told me the board had voted that morning to give me equity in the company as recognition of my critical role in its success. The equity package included shares worth significant money, plus voting rights on major company decisions. Harper said the board agreed I wasn't just an employee anymore, but a real stakeholder in what we were building, and they wanted my investment in the company's future to be formal and financial, not just professional. I accepted gratefully and thanked her for believing in me even after Raymond had tried to destroy my reputation. She smiled and said she'd learned an important lesson about actually understanding what makes a company run instead of trusting the wrong people to manage it. We shook hands, and she left, and I sat there looking at the equity documents, realizing I'd gone from being escorted out of the building to becoming a part owner in just 2 years. The operations team reserved the conference room 2 weeks in advance and decorated it with photos from our first year back showing the chaos we'd climbed out of. People brought food, and someone made a slideshow of old emails from the crisis days, with Raymond's panicked messages getting bigger laughs than they probably deserved. The warehouse crew showed up in matching shirts they'd printed that said, "Still standing," and Melanie gave a speech about how she'd quit during the worst of it, but came back because she believed in what we were building. People shared stories about the first time the ordering system crashed after I returned, and how we all stayed until midnight fixing it together, and about the day Kieran from Techline sent that email saying he trusted us again. When they asked me to say something, I kept it short, thanking everyone for showing up every day and doing excellent work even when things got hard, and I meant every word because these people had earned this celebration. We cut a cake shaped like a warehouse, and someone made a joke about it being more organized than the real warehouse used to be, and the whole room laughed because we'd all lived through those terrible weeks when nothing worked. 3 days after the celebration, I got a LinkedIn message from someone named Daniel Hill, who worked at Raymond's consulting firm, asking if I'd be willing to provide a reference for Raymond, who was applying for an operations director position. I stared at the message for a full minute, thinking about Raymond's smug face when he fired me, and all the manufactured write-ups he'd used to justify it. I typed back a polite response saying I didn't feel comfortable providing a reference based on our working relationship, and wished him luck in his search. Daniel replied, asking if I could at least confirm Raymond's employment dates, and I said he should contact Harper for any official employment verification. 2 weeks later, Melanie mentioned she'd heard through her network that Raymond was struggling to land anything stable and had been turned down for 3 positions in the past month. I felt a small flash of satisfaction hearing that, but mostly I just felt glad I'd moved on and built something better. Melanie and I spent 6 months working on the operations manual during slow afternoons and occasional Saturdays when we wanted uninterrupted time. We documented every system, every process, every client preference, every software quirk that someone would need to know to run the department without me. The manual ended up being 200 pages with screenshots, flowcharts, troubleshooting guides, and detailed explanations written in plain language that any qualified operations person could follow. I added sections about client relationship management with specific notes about what Kieran preferred for communication and how Jeffrey liked his reports formatted. Melanie wrote the entire warehouse section with backup procedures for when systems crashed and training protocols for new staff. We included emergency contacts, vendor information, contract renewal dates, and maintenance schedules for all the equipment and software. When we finished, I printed a copy and brought it to Harper's office, explaining that I never wanted the company to be held hostage by knowledge locked in one person's head again. She flipped through it looking impressed and said this was exactly the kind of forward thinking the company needed. 2 weeks later, she had it professionally bound with the company logo on the cover and placed 3 copies in the company library where any manager could access it. 5 years after Raymond fired me, I sat in my director of operations office on a Friday afternoon, looking at my calendar and realizing I had no urgent fires to put out for once. My salary had tripled from what Raymond paid me, and the equity Harper gave me was worth real money now that the company had grown. The team I'd built was strong and capable with clear succession plans, so nobody was irreplaceable, and our client relationships were the best they'd been in company history. I had respect from everyone I worked with. Financial security my younger self would have found impossible, and genuine satisfaction coming to work each day, knowing I'd built something excellent. Getting fired had felt like the end of everything when Raymond escorted me out of the building, but it forced me to recognize my actual worth instead of accepting how he treated me. I'd demanded proper compensation, built better systems, and created a team culture where people felt valued. Life was really good now in ways I'd earned through standing my ground when it would have been easier to accept less. I closed my laptop and headed home for the weekend, feeling content with where 5 years of hard work had taken me.